Ever feel like history's missing some pieces? Like maybe the story we're told about the 20th century, the one with wars and politics front and center, maybe it leaves out some crucial stuff.
I think a lot of folks would agree with you there.
That's what got me so excited to dive into The Modern Mind, this intellectual history by Peter Watson. He argues that conventional history ignores the thinkers, the artists, the scientists who really shaped the 20th century.
Yeah, he points out the 700-page history book. No Einstein, no Matisse, no Mendel. Proust is missing. It's like, wow, what else are we not getting?
Exactly. And that's where The Modern Mind comes in. Watson goes deep into the birth of modernism, this movement that really shook things up in art, music, literature.
Modernism, it was a deliberate break. Like they were saying, forget the old rules. We're going to express ourselves in totally new ways.
So rebellion against the way things were done.
You got it. And in music, nobody embodies that more than Arnold Schoenberg. This guy introduced a concept, the emancipation of dissonance. And music was never the same.
Emancipation of dissonance. Could you break that down a bit?
Sure. Before Schoenberg, musical harmony, it had these strict rules, right? Dissonance had to be resolved in a very specific way. But Schoenberg, he said, dissonance is just as important as harmony. Let's set it free.
So he embraced the rough edges instead of smoothing them out.
Exactly. People flipped out. Protests, even riots over this guy's music. Can you imagine?
Wow. What was it about his music that got people so riled up?
It was unlike anything they'd heard before. Like, take Pierrot Lunaire, one of his pieces. It uses Sprechstimme, this weird vocal style between singing and speaking. Totally bizarre for audiences back then.
But eventually Pierrot Lunaire got a standing ovation, right?
Yeah.
That says a lot about pushing boundaries. Modernism wasn't just about breaking rules for no reason.
You're right. It was about expressing emotions, ideas in completely new ways. And it wasn't just music. In the art world, you've got Picasso exploding onto the scene with Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, a painting that really messed with people's heads.
What made this painting so different, so revolutionary?
Picture this. Distorted figures, almost broken apart, in a really raw, primitive energy. It challenged everything people thought was beautiful in art. Picasso wasn't afraid to shock. Actually, he seemed to like it.
And that willingness to break the mold, that's what made it so powerful.
Yeah.
It's fascinating how all this artistic upheaval was happening alongside huge leaps in science.
That's one of the cool things about The Modern Mind. Watson connects the dots between these different areas, shows how they were all part of a bigger shift in thinking.
Like how Einstein's theory of relativity, it wasn't just about science, it changed the way artists and philosophers saw the world.
Right. Space and time are relative. The universe is this mind-blowing mystery. That's a pretty big deal if you're an artist trying to make sense of things.
It's like the ground was moving under everyone's feet. And you see this reflected in the literature of the time too, right?
Definitely. Watson digs into Joseph Conrad, particularly Heart of Darkness. This novel, it goes deep into colonialism, the dark side of human nature. Very different from the kind of romanticized stuff that came before.
Conrad really exposed the brutality, the hypocrisy of colonialism.
Absolutely. But Heart of Darkness is more than just a political statement. It's about what's inside all of us, the darkness we carry. A tough book, but still relevant today.
And then there's Marcel Proust. With In Search of Lost Time, he dives into memory, the human mind.
Proust was obsessed with this thing called involuntary memory, like how a tiny sensation, a smell, a taste can unlock all these memories, emotions. His novel, it's like a journey inside consciousness.
All this, and we've got major advances in science happening too, like the development of genetics. Watson talks about Thomas Hunt Morgan, his discovery of genes and chromosomes.
Morgan's work blew everything wide open. Heredity, mutation, it's all about genes, changed biology, medicine forever.
Of course, new discoveries always have a flip side, like eugenics, trying to control human breeding. Scary stuff.
Yeah, it reminds us that even brilliant discoveries can be twisted. And Watson doesn't shy away from that. He also explores the rise of psychology, Freud, and psychoanalysis.
Let's talk about controversial. Freud's ideas about the unconscious, sexuality, childhood, people were not ready for that.
I know, right? It's amazing how ideas that were scandalous back then are totally normal now.
And then you've got the split between Freud and Jung. They had very different views of the unconscious mind.
Totally different approaches. It just shows how dynamic intellectual history is, always evolving.
It seems like the early 20th century was this massive shift in how people saw themselves, the world around them, moving away from grand narratives, embracing a more complex view.
Yeah, and part of that is a new interest in everyday life. Like Sinclair Lewis, in his novel Babbitt, he's poking fun at the middle class, their materialism, conformity.
And in art, you've got the Ashcan School, showing the gritty side of urban life.
Not pretty, but real. It was a conscious decision to focus on individual experiences instead of some grand universal truth.
And World War I, that really accelerated this shift, wouldn't you say?
Definitely. After the war, you see these new artistic movements, like Dadaism.
Dadaism was kind of wild, wasn't it? Almost anti-art, nonsensical, absurd.
Yeah, it was a reflection of the disillusionment, the sense that the old world had failed.
And you see that same pessimism in Oswald Spengler's The Decline of the West, right? You thought Western civilization was doomed.
Bleak stuff. It's interesting to compare him to John Maynard Keynes, who was much more optimistic.
Keynes believed in government intervention to make things better. His ideas were really influential for a long time.
Yeah, they shaped economic policy for decades. It shows the tension between believing in free markets and wanting the government to step in for social justice. And then you have the British Marxist historians coming along, challenging the usual historical narratives.
They wanted to tell the stories of everyday people, their struggles.
Exactly. The modern mind really takes you on a journey, doesn't it? So many ideas, artistic innovation, social movements. It's a lot to unpack.
It really shows how dynamic and interconnected intellectual history is. And we're only just scratching the surface.
There's so much more to explore. The atomic bomb, the space race, civil rights, women's liberation, existentialism.
It's clear the 20th century was this incredible melting pot of ideas, always pushing boundaries. The modern mind gives us a map to navigate it all. We'll pick up where we left off in part 2.
Moving into the post-war world, there's this one event that really changes everything, both for science and politics. I'm talking about the atomic bomb.
The atomic bomb. I mean, how could things ever be the same after that? The whole idea of war, global politics, everything shifted with the threat of nuclear annihilation.
Watson really breaks down how it happened, the scientists involved, Einstein, of course, and the massive ethical questions that came with it.
I can't even imagine the weight those scientists must have felt, knowing the destructive power they had unleashed.
That burden is something scientists still deal with today, especially with new tech like genetic engineering. It's not just about the science, it's the impact.
And speaking of science changing the world, the Cold War and the space race, that was a crazy time for tech advancements.
Absolutely insane. The U.S. versus the Soviet Union, that rivalry pushed both sides to do some amazing things in space exploration.
I bet the launch of Sputnik, that first satellite, really shook things up in America.
Oh, yeah, major shock. It was a huge win for the Soviets, and the U.S., they got kind of freaked out.
Yeah.
Suddenly there was all this money poured into science education and research. They had to catch up.
It's wild how one event can totally change a country's priorities.
The space race, though, it did more than just teach us about space. It gave us all this amazing tech we use every day, from satellites to GPS. It's a huge legacy.
Incredible ripple effects. But while all that was going on up in space, there were equally big changes happening down here on Earth, socially and culturally.
The civil rights movement, especially in the U.S., people were finally standing up against racial inequality, demanding justice and real change.
And figures like W.E.B. Du Bois, they were so crucial in that fight. His writing, his activism against racism, so powerful.
And at the same time, the women's liberation movement was gaining momentum, challenging all those traditional ideas about gender roles, pushing for equal rights.
Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, that was a turning point. She spoke for so many women who felt trapped by society's expectations.
Her work really opened up the conversation about what it meant to be a woman in that era, paved the way for some major changes.
It's inspiring how people fought for justice and equality. They reshaped the 20th century in so many ways. And while all this is happening, new ways of thinking are emerging, ideas that would have a huge impact on how we see the world, like existentialism.
Existentialism, it was all about individual freedom, taking responsibility, and trying to find meaning in a world that often felt pretty absurd. Thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, they were wrestling with these big questions about existence, alienation, authenticity, what it means to be human.
Existentialism wasn't just some academic thing either. It was everywhere, in books, movies, art. It spoke to the anxieties and uncertainty a lot of people felt, especially after World War II.
And then there's structuralism and post-structuralism coming along. These ideas really challenged how we think about language, meaning, power, all that.
Yeah, people like Claude Lévi-Strauss and Michel Foucault, they were digging into the hidden structures that shape how we see the world, saying these structures, even if we're not aware of them, they have a huge influence on how we think and act.
Complicated stuff, for sure, but it influenced a lot of fields, anthropology, literary criticism, everything.
And as we get closer to the end of the 20th century, we've got this explosion of mass media and technology
Yeah.
that created a whole new set of challenges and possibilities.
Marshall McLuhan, he was ahead of his time. His idea that the medium is the message. It basically means the way we communicate is just as important as what we're actually saying.
And his vision of the global village,
Yep.
this interconnected world through media, it's amazing how he predicted how tech would bring us closer, but also create new forms of loneliness.
And with mass media feeding us all this information and entertainment, we run into a new problem: information overload.
It's like we're drowning in information. How do you even tell what's true anymore?
That's something we're still dealing with, trying to find our way in the digital age. It's clear, though, that the ideas and trends of the 20th century, they're still shaping us today.
Reading The Modern Mind, it really strikes me how much the relationship between science and society changed in the 20th century. As science got more complicated, it kind of raised this question: who gets to understand this stuff? And how should experts and regular people interact in a democracy?
It makes me think about C.P. Snow. He gave this famous lecture called The Two Cultures. His point was that there was a growing gap between scientists and literary intellectuals. Each side had trouble even understanding what the other was talking about. Snow argued that this hurt both science and the humanities.
It's like they're speaking totally different languages.
Yeah.
And you see this worry about who can access scientific knowledge even more, with the whole story of DNA's structure being discovered. Watson, Crick, and Franklin, right?
Absolutely pivotal moment, that discovery. Suddenly we understood heredity in a whole new way, and it opened up crazy possibilities like genetic engineering. But the story itself, the collaboration, the competition, the ethical dilemmas, it's fascinating.
Yeah, being able to manipulate life at that level, it brings up so many big ethical questions. What are the limits of science, and what about unintended consequences?
It's a constant reminder that you can't separate science from society. There are always social, political, and ethical factors mixed in. And this back and forth between science and society, it's really obvious in the debate about consciousness.
Consciousness. I mean, philosophers have been trying to figure that out forever. What is that subjective experience, that awareness?
And more recently, scientists have jumped in, trying to find the biological basis of consciousness, how it connects to the brain. Francis Crick, one of the guys who figured out DNA, he actually spent the rest of his life studying consciousness. He thought it was a totally valid scientific question.
But even with all we know about the brain now, that subjective feeling of consciousness, it's still a mystery, right? How do you even measure something that personal?
Exactly. So many unanswered questions about how physical stuff happening in the brain creates that feeling of awareness. It makes you realize how mysterious consciousness really is, and maybe science can't explain everything.
So as we finish up this deep dive into the modern mind, what really sticks with me is just how much intellectual history is constantly changing and how connected everything is.
It's like this huge web of ideas linking up different fields of knowledge, different times, even different cultures. Watson's book shows just how powerful ideas are in shaping how we see the world and ourselves.
The modern mind, it encourages us to really grapple with these ideas, to question them, to build on them, think critically. Don't just accept things at face value, and see how all these different areas of knowledge fit together. It's like this reminder that trying to find meaning and understanding, that's a journey that never really ends. It's still shaping us today.
If you want to go on that journey yourself, you've got to check out The Modern Mind. There's a link to buy the book in the episode description. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and share it with anyone who loves exploring ideas. We'll be back soon with another fascinating topic. Until then, keep those minds curious and engaged.